Hello everyone, my name is Amber Ferger and today I'll be presenting the final project for CUNY DATA620 Web Analytics for the 2020 session. My group members are Misha Kollontai, Zach Alexander, and Suba Rout. So for our final project, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the current coronavirus pandemic in the United States. Our primary objective was to identify relationships between cities and overall sentiment towards COVID. So we dug through a lot of different tweets and we wanted to answer some of the following questions. First, does positive sentiment precede spikes in positive cases? Second, is there a relationship between location-specific COVID-19 sentiment and the events that took place? For this particular piece of the analysis, we looked at two cities. First was New York City, which had a very severe initial wave, and second, New Orleans, which is experiencing some sort of second wave. On top of that, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and see if we could find a network of relationships between major U.S. cities and their shared hashtags. So we aimed to create this network where nodes represented cities and edges represented shared use of hashtags. Our secondary objectives, we wanted to answer the following questions. What additional issues are there that are discussed in conjunction with COVID-19? This would involve looking at the shared hashtags. What differences in hashtags use is there? And then are there certain cities that care about similar issues so that they share a subset of hashtags? So our data, first we generated a list of geocodes that were related to the most populous city in each state in the U.S. Our Twitter data came from a package called Get Old Tweets. Originally, we wanted to use the Twitter API to pull information, but we realized it only went back 5 days, so this package was the solution for us. We looked at tweets between 3/8/2020, which was about the onset of the pandemic in the U.S., all the way to 7/15/2020. We pulled the tweets in weekly groupings, and we looked for any tweet that contained the word COVID or had it in one of the hashtags. The limit on the total number of tweets per API call was 1,000 per week. Some of the cities met this 1,000 and others did not. The final output included the actual tweet text, the additional hashtags, the tweet date, and then the Twitter username and city coordinates. We did create a separate workbook for this, so if you're interested, you can look at the tweet poll notebook contained in this GitHub repo. And then our COVID case numbers for the two cities that we did the analysis on came from Johns Hopkins COVID-19 data, and we looked at Wikipedia as well for these numbers. So the first thing that we're doing is just importing the Twitter data. We can see for our two cities that we're doing the preliminary analysis on that we have 1,800 tweets for New York and then 1,756 for New Orleans. And before digging into the analysis, we wanted to see some characteristics of the text that we were dealing with. So the first thing that we're doing is we're using the text blob library to analyze the overall sentiment of all of the tweets. Interestingly, we see that about 47% of the tweets are positive sentiment, whereas only 24% are neutral or negative. We need to take this with a bit of caution. The range is from -1 to +1, and this classification doesn't necessarily tell us the strength of that relationship, whether they're very positive versus very negative. So it's possible that some of the positively classified tweets are teetering on the edge of 0, so just take this with some caution. The next thing we wanted to do was analyze what sort of words are in the text that we're looking at. We can see really big here that Instagram is a top word, which is interesting to us. We're not quite sure why. Some of the other big words that we can see are thank, probably thanking our hospital workers. We have Trump that's showing up really big, death as well, and then people. And then finally, we can look at those most commonly found words in the tweets, and we can see the distribution of them all. People is occurring the most frequently at about almost 7,000 times, and then the top 10th one is home. That occurs about 2,500 times. Now we can import our COVID case data. We did a lot of manipulation on this information to get it into a format that we needed. The information came as counts that were cumulative, so what we had to do was define a couple of functions that identified first the rolling 7-day average, and then second the number of new cases per day. We can see at the bottom here our cleaned data. This is a sample for New Orleans, and then this is a sample for New York. So part one of our analysis really focused on the sentiment analysis, and as a reminder, we wanted to look at two different questions. First, does positive sentiment precede spikes in positive cases? And second, is there a relationship between location-specific COVID-19 sentiment and the events that took place? So for this particular piece, we're using the Vader package. This basically gives a score of positive, negative, neutral, and compound. The compound is a score between -1 and 1, similar to that polarity score that we looked at before, and that's what we'll be using in the analysis. So here we're just applying that for the sentiment method to each of our New York and New Orleans tweets. And then at the bottom here, we're locating specific important dates and times for events that took place in each New York City and New Orleans. This will be used in the visualization of the COVID cases versus the sentiment. When we look at New Orleans, we can see that we do have a very high peak around mid-April, which is what we expected. We have also listed some of the important events that took place. Two that are to note are New Orleans. Right here at the mid-June point is when it joins the rest of the state in phase 2 of reopening. And then around the late June, we see that the governor halts the reopening process and decides not to move to phase 3 because there have been an increase in the number of cases. When we plot the sentiment of New Orleans with respect to the same timeline, we can see some interesting trends. So first, at the phase 2 reopening, we see that we have a negative sentiment for the average tweets at the beginning of that, and after that is announced that they're going to join the rest of the state in reopening, we see a peak in the number of positive sentiments here. So this was kind of interesting to see that it followed that. Similarly, when the governor announced that they were not going to be reopening in phase 3, we see that that sentiment goes from a positive to a negative, which was interesting to us. To answer our research question, that does it seem to precede spikes in positive cases, that positive sentiment? We don't see a clear relationship between the number of cases and the sentiment towards coronavirus. Instead, as we discussed, it's more related to the events that took place. Now, looking at New York, we have less of a conclusive decisions based on the analysis of this. We can see that our spikes are happening about mid-April, which is when most of the country had that really drastic increase in the number of cases, and then gradual decrease in the number of cases. Our sentiment doesn't really follow a clear pattern that's related to that information. We can see when the peak starts to decrease that we're seeing a little bit of a increase in positive sentiment, and then also as the longer that we are in this period of not full reopening, that our sentiment is a little bit more negative. So now we'll switch gears and focus on the network analysis piece of the project. From this analysis, we hoped to identify what sort of hashtags are shared between different cities. We've decided to create a network where nodes represent U.S. cities. They'll have 5 different attributes: position, which is the actual coordinates in latitude and longitude, the population count, the cumulative number of COVID cases, this was as of 7/14/2020, and then the proportion of cases per population, and then finally the region. So these were distinct geographical boundaries that we decided to assign to each state. Additionally, the edges will represent the shared hashtags, and then they're weighted based on the number of shared tweets that the 2 cities have. So this preliminary part is just setting up the data to be used in the network. I'll skip over that except for the top hashtags part. This is kind of interesting. We can see for all cities combined that these are the top hashtags that are shared. Stay home and social distancing appear quite frequently within the text corpus. Now when we create our network, the first thing that we did was we displayed the network in 2 different ways. First, it was based on the physical geographical coordinates. So we created a grid and used those latitude and longitude points to map out on the grid where each city is. So you can see that it roughly kind of mimics the shape of the US. We've got Alaska up here and Hawaii down here. What we've done is we've created the size of the node based on the proportion of confirmed COVID cases. So the larger the node, the larger the proportion of the population that was affected. We can see LA and Salt Lake City, for example, are pretty big. The node color is based on those regional designations. So for example, we have Upper East Coast, Lower East Coast, Midwest, and that is clearly displayed here on the map because this is the actual orientation of the US. And then the thickness is based on the number of shared tweets between the two cities. So we can see that this is pretty busy. We don't really glean much information off of this because each of the cities is in their geographic location. So what we decided to do was visualize this in a spring layout, which gives us a little bit more information about the network itself. So some interesting things about this network. Let me zoom out a little bit here so we can see in full. First, that the East and West Coast cities are more central to the network. This is probably because they have a high number of cases and are talking quite a bit about the pandemic. Another thing that was interesting to us is that our Midwest cities, so we can look at Milwaukee here, Des Moines down here, these are lower in case counts and they're also less active in the conversation. So we can see them on the outskirts of that central dense portion of the network. And then this is probably one of the most interesting things. We see some major cities like Charleston and Salt Lake that are at the outskirts of the network, which was interesting to us because these have large nodes, which means that a large portion of the population was affected by COVID, yet they're still at the outer skirts of the network, which is indicative of what we suspect, that they're engaging in discussions about the pandemic, but they're just not sharing the same types of hashtags as the more centrally dense part of the network. So in summary, what we've done through this project, we achieved two main goals. One, we identified the relationship between the tweet sentiment, COVID cases, and COVID-related events. And then two, we've understood the similarities in hashtag use between major US cities. So from the sentiment analysis, from New Orleans, we saw that the sentiment kind of loosely followed the events that took place. When the phase 2 started to reopen, we saw phase 2 started to happen in Louisiana. We saw that the sentiment of the text tended to become more positive. And then when the governor announced that they were holding off on going to phase 3, we saw more frustration and ultimately more negativity about the pandemic. New York was a little bit less clear in the relationship between the sentiment and the events that took place. We do see a more positive view of the pandemic once the COVID numbers started to decrease, but a more consistent negative view as the pandemic continues to drag on. From our network analysis, we saw that there are some cities that are more central to the network, and these included those cities that are on the Upper East Coast and West Coast that tended to have a higher number of COVID cases, so they were kind of leading the discussion. We also saw some of the Midwest cities that had lower case counts were on the outskirts of the network. So for future work for this project, we were able to answer our 5 main research question, but our final stretch question was, is there a relationship between COVID hashtags and the number of positive cases in that region? We only really looked at New Orleans and New York, so future work could involve looking at this in terms of the entire US, so for all different cities. We also started to play around with identifying location-specific differences in tweet hashtags. So one of the ones that was interesting to us was MAGA as a hashtag versus Trump as a national disgrace. Looking at that and seeing the differences in location based on the tweets that were including those hashtags. We feel that there's probably a number of other polarizing tweets that we could glean insights from. And then finally, as we mentioned before, a word of caution about the sentiment analysis. We did start to look a little bit at what tweets were being categorized as positive versus negative, and we saw that some of the time the package didn't pick up on sarcasm, so it was potentially labeling things as positive when they should really be labeled as negative. So as a next step, we could work to create our own sentiment analyzer to more accurately classify the tweets. And that concludes the presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of my team members or I. Thank you.